We do know the story of the Magi who visited Jesus and his family in Bethlehem, right? Some say they were kings. More likely, they were astrologers who had studied the night sky for years in search of a sign. They were probably Zoroastrians, followers of an ancient religion which taught that a Messiah would come and the stars would show the way. Some say there were 3 of these stargazers, but we don't know that, just that they brought collectively 3 kinds of gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We don't actually know how many there were, whether they were important statesmen or eccentric cosmologists, or even how they traveled. Camels are not mentioned in the account provided by Matthew. What we do know is that they had traveled from far, far away seeking a king. Their star map showed them that the land where they would find him would be the land called Judea, and logic showed them that a king was likely to be born in Judea's royal city, Jerusalem, so that's where they looked first. What they found in Jerusalem was a king, all right, King Herod the Great. And despite their purported wisdom, they said a very foolish thing: "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." Well, these men knew how to decipher star charts far better than they knew how to read human beings, unless the king had been proudly cradling a baby in his arms, celebrating the birth of his own flesh and blood heir. News of a child born King of the Jews would not have been well received by King Herod the Great, who actually was King of the Jews. In fact, even if the newborn king had been of his own flesh and blood, look out, King Herod was notoriously paranoid of anyone threatening his claim to power. He even had his wife and 3 sons murdered out of fear that they would steal his throne. So when he asked the Magi, ever so innocently, to go find the child and send him the address so he could pay his own proper respects, it was clear to Matthew's audience, who knew the terrible history of that great tyrant, that this was a trap. And although the Magi were warned in a dream not to go back to King Herod, the damage was done. His religious advisors had guessed that the child was probably in Bethlehem, according to an ancient prophecy. So when the Magi failed to return with the name and address of one boy from Bethlehem, King Herod sent his henchmen to that sleepy little town to kill off every possible candidate, meaning every single boy under the age of 2. It's unthinkable. An entire village with no toddler boys. It was from this horror that Joseph and Mary ran, clutching their precious boy to them, risking their own lives to save his, embarking on a journey, likely on foot, to a faraway place called Egypt, which in their collective memory was synonymous with their ancestors' enslavement and infant genocide. Egypt, of all places, seemed their safest bet in such times. It was far enough away from the reach of an enraged king who would spare no one, not even his own children, to stay in power. It's hard to talk about that story. We do like the part about the Magi and their visit, the shining gold, the pungent frankincense and myrrh. We love the idea of people traveling from the other end of the world as they understood it to meet Jesus, the star child, whose life would bring light, not to one nation under God, but to all people in all places and all times. It's a beautiful, cosmic, shining star of a story, but the rest of it, well, we don't put King Herod or his soldiers up here with the nativity scene, even though they are as much a part of Jesus' story as the Magi ever were. For every wise one who knelt down adoringly before the little Lord Jesus, there were many others who plotted to have him destroyed. And if we want to understand the fullness of Jesus' story, we have to look both ways. We have to see Herod and his co-conspirators and understand what they were if we are to understand what Jesus was not. We have to look not only to Bethlehem, where the star shone brightly and the angels sang, but also to Jerusalem, to the palace of an angry king who surrounded himself with supporters who were pleased to carry out his wishes. You see, King Herod was called King Herod the Great, for he had done great things for Judea: roads, ports, aqueducts. He'd even fixed up the temple beautifully, to the delight of the religious leaders who lined up right behind him. He was a great leader if you could overlook the atrocious things he did in his personal life, or what he did to those poor little boys in Bethlehem. But we are entering the season called Epiphany, which is not a time for overlooking anything. Epiphany is the time for seeing the goodness of God on display, of seeing what it is to have God with us, to see God's love reflected in the way a mother looks at her child. and also in the way a father carries him when he's too tired to walk all the way to Egypt, the way they all continue despite exhaustion, fear, and homesickness. This is a time to see that Mary and Joseph carried their child all the way across nations and borders into a land where they only hoped to receive welcome. And even though a tyrant's army was against them, God was with them as they held Emmanuel in their arms, protecting him from the wild things that roamed the roads leading to Egypt, because that was the only road leading away from death. The full story of Epiphany is not only about gift-bearing wise men, but also about tyranny and terror. It's a story about looking both ways, to see what we are moving toward and to see what we are leaving behind. The wise men put Herod behind them and moved toward the Christ child, but because they remembered what was back there in Jerusalem, they never went that way again. Joseph and Mary embarked on the journey to Egypt, seeking life and safety, and put Herod behind them forever. Even when that old king died and they could return, they knew his son was ruling in his place, so they went back, but not to Bethlehem. Instead, they went to Nazareth, outside the reach of a new king. You see, the journey forward must always be informed by what is behind. A safe traveler heeds the old advice probably learned in early childhood: look both ways. Look left and right before you cross the street, yes, but also look both ahead and behind. Know where you want to go, but also know what you want to leave, lest you find yourself circling back on the road that leads to the old familiar place. We can apply the lesson of look both ways to our personal growth, and I hope that we will. As we set goals, which is a rather popular thing to do this time of year, I hope that we will align our goals with what we see in the divine incarnation of Jesus the Christ. For instance, Jesus embodied love and empathy, and if we would move toward becoming more loving and empathetic, then we must intentionally leave behind fear and judgment. Jesus instructed his disciples to be generous in service to others, which means being mindful of the selfish inclinations that hold us back. Jesus taught forgiveness, which means that we absolutely must let go of all bitterness, grudges, and resentment. To hang on to any of the old things means circling right back to Jerusalem when it is Bethlehem that we seek. Looking both ways is also how we grow collectively as humans. Knowing where we have come from, knowing our shared history, our mistakes, our weakness, it's critical in charting our path forward. When we are blind to human history, or when we see it only in shades of rose, we will not evolve into kinder, healthier people, to the detriment of the entire world that God so loves. We can see where we need to improve. I think we all want clean air and water, healthy ecosystems, quality of life for all people everywhere, safe schools where children can learn without fear. To achieve any of our many goals, we must look both ways, at the ideas and practices that will bring us there and at those that will not. We simply can't turn a blind eye to the things that have caused suffering. It takes wisdom and courage to look both ways, which is why we need both of these stories, that of the wise men and that of a family running for their lives. The wise men teach us to identify Christ, to see what he is in contrast to what he is not. If we too are seeking Christ, then we must wisely discern what he represents and avoid going in any other direction. As for Joseph and Mary, they show us that it takes courage to chart a new way forward. I'm sure they were terrified about a long journey to Egypt on foot with a little one, but there was no other way, no shortcut that would have been safe. They either went or they faced the consequences. Sooner or later, they would have paid the price, and they simply couldn't afford to lose their greatest treasure. There was only one way out, and it was Egypt. Any other road would have led them back to Herod. Let us learn them from both the richly robed stargazers and a footsore family of asylum seekers. Let us learn the lessons from all these journeys. We must learn to look both ways in order to stay on the path leading to life abundant. Of Jesus the